What's up, y'all? Welcome to Better on the Inside, a podcast for working for a church without losing your soul. My name is John, and I am your host and digital pastor. And I mean, if we're keeping it real, the beginning of the year is a very hard time if you work in ministry because this is a ramp up time, right? A lot of people make their New Year's resolution to go back to church and they're coming. And so there's a lot of strain on folks that work in ministry right now. And so the Better on the Inside ethos, man, you could be giving away so much to other people. You could be creating these amazing experiences that sometimes your spiritual growth and your spiritual life goes on the back burner. And you can't give what you don't have. So it's important that you take time, right? You're a masterpiece of God too. You're just as important and you're not expendable. So it's important that you take time to invest in your own spiritual growth and do that. And that's part of why the podcast exists. Today, I get to talk to Dr. Sam One, an Old Testament professor at Dallas Theological Seminary and a pop culture dude. I mean, this guy's a Slash and he's a Michigan guy. So maybe I shouldn't talk about Slash like Cordell Stewart, former University of Colorado quarterback. Oh gosh, that's so random. This guy's a Slash, so maybe I shouldn't talk about Cordell Stewart, former Colorado University quarterback and Hail Mary Michigan killer guy. But Sam's been a pastor, he's been a pharmacist, and he's still a comic book nerd, it seems like. And so Sam helps shed light on something that I think is relevant to a lot of people right now. A lot of people at the beginning of the year kick off their reading plan and they want to read the Bible in a year. And they're going through the Old Testament. And so you're probably still in Genesis or Exodus, so that's good. But sometimes the Old Testament can really bog folks down in their reading plan and they can be discouraged and it can be a difficult thing. So I talked to Sam of like how you can breathe life into that plan by understanding the Old Testament a little bit differently and maybe taking a little bit of a different approach. We also get a chance to talk about what the Old Testament is and how it actually relates to Marvel Comics, which is an amazing thing. And then we get some really good pop culture and art conversation around legalism and how certain Christian circles have drawn lines around pop culture and art in a way that maybe God never intended us to do. So this is a really great discussion. I really enjoyed my time with them and I hope you will too. What's up, y'all? I'm here with Sam One, the one and only dude that I get a chance to talk to. This is really our first time speaking in person, right? Digitally, but still very cool. Hello, Sam.
Hey, John, it's good to be on with you. I really appreciate the invite.
Yeah.
Thanks for just reaching out, making it happen.
We've been great Twitter friends because I love the stuff that you post and it's incredibly thoughtful. You also love college football. You're a Michigan guy. Great year this year.
I'll take it.
Yeah,
it
didn't end great, but you know what? You lost to the national champion, so it's like,
Right.
Yeah.
And considering I have some pretty hot opinions on the state of college football, but we won't go into that today. But in light of that, I think what Michigan did was fantastic, and I'm going to celebrate that. Yep.
Yeah. Oh man, we could talk. My in-laws are Michigan people, so we could talk about Michigan.
Oh, okay.
Maybe we set up a subscription. If subscribe and pay $10 to listen to Sam's Michigan thoughts. But Sam, one of the reasons of the ways we connected is that you're an adjunct professor of Old Testament at Dallas Theological Seminary. And so I was kind of tweeting through like, hey, don't read the whole Bible in a year, basically. That's the summary. And you really brought up a point of the beauty of the Old Testament. And so as people are going through their read the Bible in a year plans, it's, late January. They're starting to get into the end of Genesis probably and eventually going into some other stuff. And so I wanted to talk to you, Sam, just about kind of unlocking some of that Old Testament beauty for the folks that are reading it.
Absolutely. So one of the things first of all, I am very sympathetic to what you said. In fact, I am not a huge read through the Bible plan guy. I see the benefit of it for certain people. Now, my wife, for example, does it every year, and she's great at it. And she's to the point where I think when she's doing it, she has certain things she's already kind of digested. Right. So she's not coming to it with fresh eyes every single time. So she's able to come in each year and see something new that adds to maybe things she's already built. So there's a foundation there. Right. But you had mentioned earlier, and I totally agree, for someone who's kind of new to the faith or new to spiritual disciplines, this type of reading can be discouraging because you will get to points in the Old Testament, especially, and even though I'm an OT guy, I'll be the first to admit, man, it's hard to read it. And I think that's because there is a cultural separation that's greater than what we have with the New Testament. So the New Testament is rooted in first century Greco-Roman culture. So the cultural context, the atmosphere is a little bit more westernized than it is in the Old Testament. Old Testament is purely ancient Near Eastern. Yeah. And so there's a lot of things that are just alien to us or just unfamiliar to us. So there's a lot of figurative language in the Old Testament that is just mysterious. There are genres in the Old Testament that are not familiar to us. And so when we're reading in them, it does feel daunting. So I'm just going to leave this real quick analogy with you and then let you kind of, talk about how you see this. Yeah. I think the Old Testament is often misunderstood and not appreciated because it's like going to a museum and not really having a guide or a docent to take you through that experience. I have been in museums where I kind of just went in on my own and I got a lot out of it. Like I would, recognize certain works, or I would just sit and stare at a painting or a sculpture and knowing nothing about it, I'm still seeing something in it, and that's great. But I tell you what, if you ever do guided tours, it takes it to a whole different level. Now the experience comes alive because now you're having someone who's got some understanding of the works to be able to tell you the background behind this. What was the painter going through when he did this work? Where does it fit in with his or her career arc? Maybe show me a couple of paintings from their early years and then their later years and let me see how they progressed. I mean, having that kind of experience changes the way you experience a trip to a museum. So I would say that when you read the Old Testament in a guided tour format with someone who can help you understand some of those nuances and subtle things that are hard to tap into, it changes the Old Testament. But most people don't do that when they're doing these read-through-a-year programs.
Yeah. Whew. That is an incredible answer. And there's a few things many things that I love about it. The analogy is spot on. But I think because the Bible comes bound all together in one big book, we're kind of thinking of it as a monolithic thing. Like, oh, it's all the same. Mm-hmm. Whereas a lot of stuff you're reading from the Old Testament is thousands of years older than what you're reading in the New Testament.
Yes.
It's not just like a generation or two. I mean, it's thousands of years. It's the different, it's from us to Jesus and further, right? And so the 1,000-year difference, the difference culture, I hadn't really thought about the idea of Greco-Roman culture because so much of Western culture is kind of built on that. And in some ways, this is the foundation of Western culture. And so to go to a more Eastern, Middle Eastern, Eastern kind of culture and then go back thousands of years, it's foreign. The context is completely foreign. And I have a million questions to ask you, but one of them is practical though. And what do you think people can do to kind of get a guide through that if they do want to take this trip? Because it's worthwhile, right? Like going into the museum and seeing these paintings and going, oh man, I would love to know more about that. Like I can enjoy it for what it is, but when you have the context, you enjoy it more. And so what would you recommend for somebody that's going through the Old Testament to have that kind of a guide?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the practicality I love. So here's what my offering is this. Instead of following this regimented plan where you're like literally reading verse by verse through the entire Old Testament on a schedule, I think a better way to approach it for those who are coming into it maybe for the first time or are just kind of are new to the Old Testament is to actually study different aspects of the Old Testament and not study every single verse, but read kind of in what I would call based on genre and theological categories. So I think one of the easiest access points in the OT is narrative. So Hebrew narrative is great. It is beautiful storytelling. And sometimes the simplicity of the Hebrew language when it is in narrative mode can be deceptive because we mistake the simplicity for lack of artistic value. And actually, when I teach like Jonah or Ruth to some of our early Hebrew students, they usually come out just, I didn't know that. I thought I knew Jonah. I thought I knew Ruth. And now I'm seeing it in a whole new light because now that we're reading it in Hebrew, I can actually catch these figurative turns of phrase, these gorgeous like uses of things like irony and intertextuality. And if we miss those, then we can flatten these narratives to very simplistic stories. And so what we do is we take a story like Jonah, which is incredibly deep, no pun intended, and we turn it into a flannel graph VBS story. And that's not where that book really takes you if you're willing to read it. So practically speaking, the first thing I would do is instead of reading by a plan, I would actually look at if you have someone at your church, maybe one of your pastors, maybe one of the elders, or maybe like a teaching pastor, ask them, hey, would you be willing to just sit with me once a week or so and break down some of the stuff I'm reading? And I know a lot of pastors who would love to do that.
Oh my gosh, they would nerd out. Like, because when you preach, especially, you are kind of focused on mostly New Testament. And then when you're pulling from the Old Testament, it's connecting it to the New Testament. And so it's like, there are people out there that are just like, I am the leading Habakkuk scholar. Like, there are people out there that love those books that like you don't really ever see in prime time, right? That you don't necessarily do a Bible study for, you don't necessarily teach on stage. Like getting in, like we would love to nerd out. Like to your point, there's somebody in your church that would nerd out over going through Jonah with you.
Exactly. And so I would start with the narratives, the great narratives. So reading through Genesis and Exodus, that is usually where people do great in these plans. And it's because these are foundational seminal narratives. They actually create and define certain ideas and images that then become the building blocks later in the Old Testament and are reference points. So the Exodus, for example, the escape from Egypt, becomes an image that defines salvation in salvation history. So you want to know that story. You want to know it in detail so that when you see echoes of it and allusions to it and references to it later on, you're not missing it. So that one thing, if you have access to someone who can help you, that's a great way to do it. And so instead of being super ambitious and saying, I'm going to read through the whole OT this year, maybe just be content to say, hey, let's meet once a week. And I'd love to see if we can cover 3 or 4, maybe 5, just narratives. So Samuel Kings, the story of the Davidic kingship and the birth of the monarchy. That's so important to helping us understand, because in the ups and the downs of that, we get a sense of who Jesus will be as King and Messiah and as Son of David. And then when you come to the New Testament and people are crying out, Son of David, save us, you've got a whole different appreciation for who that is and why they see Jesus that way. So that's the second practical step is if you do not have someone like that accessible, which many don't, there are great books out there. I would start with what are called more like preaching or popular level commentaries or Bible background references. And there's plenty of them out there, so I'm not going to go into specific ones, but these are the commentaries and references that can at least help you make sense of the geography and the culture, because that will go a long way to helping you understand and appreciate what's happening. So those are great ways. And if you don't want to go that far, because those can get pricey, even a good study Bible, and then reading the actual introductory material in your study Bible that gives you what we call provenance. And that's just a fancy way of saying, when was this written? Who wrote it? And then what was it written about in the historical context of that time? Yeah. And although there's a lot of discussion on some of these books that's still going on, For the most part, there is great info out there that'll help get you situated so that once you know who the Assyrians are and where things are with Assyria around that time, then Jonah, all of a sudden, you're going to increase your ability to understand the dynamics in play. But if you go in and you have no concept of who Assyria is, it will take out some of what you really were meant to get from the book. So those are just some of the more practical things I would recommend.
Oh, those are beautiful. And great practicality because one, there's a relational piece to it, right? To connect with somebody who loves this stuff. And the other is there are so many resources out there to draw on. And I know that I use them all the time in preaching or in teaching or whatever. And so we'll probably try to find a list of stuff that we can like put in the show notes or something, just like free commentaries and other kinds of things and that you can nerd out about. But one of the things you talk about were the narratives, and gosh, the Hebrew culture was a very storytelling kind of culture. Yep. And so like once even the written word came to write all this stuff down, it's beautiful. And I can't read Hebrew, but even just digging into it a little bit, there's some beauty that you can easily miss because you're just, it's flat. It's flattened in English. That's the word to use, is flattened. And so these narratives are so great. And they're honestly like telenovelas. Like, I mean, you talk about the Genesis Exodus narrative, man, there's some messed up stories in Genesis. And then you've got the Davidic narrative with the kings and Solomon, and like, whoa. And you've got Saul, David. It's like, that's better than the TV that you're flipping on. And it's like, oh, you thought Game of Thrones had some messed up stuff. This is even worse. They're good stories, but to your point, they point to this redemptive arc. They point to something way bigger than just themselves that give you so much context. So I love that.
Absolutely.
I love that. And there are some other genres in there that are maybe harder to read. And so I remember going to seminary where, some of the prophets, right? Jonah's an example of that, but some of the prophetic literature can be hard. But there's even like plays within the literature in there, right? And so the genre piece of what you're talking about of narrative, and then there's there's poetry, and my seminary professors would be like, "Can you remember all the genres?" But you even mentioned something like irony, and if we're reading this thousands of years later on a flat English translated Bible. And maybe we're reading something that goes, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't sound like God, or that doesn't sound like something this person would say. And then we kind of move on. But some of what you're talking about is actual like irony or like sarcasm, like for lack of a better, And so to know that there are different genres, first of all, it's probably going to be, there's some people that will listen will probably go, there are different genres? Like, right? Like you don't even think about that piece. So, what are some of the other genres that are in the Old Testament?
Yeah, and so I would say the next one that I really love to kind of delve into is Hebrew poetry. So Hebrew poetry is, there are things you can learn even as at the lay level about the way Hebrew poetry works, that if you have, if you're reading it in English, you will start to, trained readers will pick up on some of those things. So one of the big things I like to point to is parallelism. And you don't have to be able to read the Hebrew to always see it, because it's actually built into the shape of the poetry, and it comes through in most of the translation. So parallelism is just the pairing of these lines. So it might be two different cola paired together, or it might be two phrases within one colon. But what it is parallelism is this wonderfully elegant way of taking two lines of poetry and creating an impression. So sometimes the parallelism is just synonymous. It's like line A, and then line B reiterates line A. So here you just have repetition, and repetition is the mother of learning. So sometimes the poet just wants to reinforce a point, and he or she will put it into multiple lines in different wording. Sometimes the second line, line B, is actually opposite in meaning to the first line. So you have antithetical parallelism, and this is powerful because this creates a lasting impression rhetorically, because now you're going, oh man, like I'm definitely, you see this in Proverbs a lot. So in Proverbs, for example, you'll say, on the one hand, the wise son gladdens a father's heart, but the foolish son, it just despair for the mother. And so you have these two opposite ideas, but it creates this contrast that is very memorable. So you have that. And then of course, if you're taking my 104 class, we get into all these like more advanced levels, things like synthetic parallelisms and progressive parallelisms. But the idea is when you are reading, I'll give you this pro tip. When you look at the way lines are structured in your English translation, most English translations are doing a pretty good job of honoring the colon and the strophe structure in the original Hebrew. So where you see the indents and the lines cutting off and starting over in the next line, that's not random. Mm-hmm. That's actually following a Hebrew textual kind of structure. So pay attention to that and think about, hey, how is this one line is being echoed in the next line? Is it opposite? Is it repetition? Or is it progressive? Like, is it line A says something and then line B expands line A? So there's all these things that even English readers can pick up on. And as you do so, you start to go, oh, I appreciate this more. And I would liken it to this. When you're in high school English and you're learning, reading Shakespeare, your English teachers are just hammering home just how important it is for you to understand things like iambic pentameter and the sonnet structure, like a sonnet, 14 lines, or, with a haiku, what is it that defines a haiku? 3 lines with certain number of syllables. It's the same thing with Hebrew poetry. Once you start to learn the conventions, you realize that in structure, there's freedom, and these poets are doing wonderful things with that. So, poetry, the next genre is prophetic writings. And within it, there's a lot of subgenres because you have judgment oracles, you have announcements of salvation, you also have like predictive prophecy, you have contingent prophecy, and then the hardest of all, I think, is apocalyptic. So what you see in Daniel, it gets absolutely misunderstood by even those at high levels of scholarship, because if you do not understand the key Rosetta Stone type of tools that we have, we will completely misunderstand. Because the key to prophetic literature is understanding where the prophet is being literal and where he is speaking in figures. And it's not always easy to pick up on that. Yeah. So that's where a lot of misunderstanding comes in with prophetic literature. And so I would say, like, start with narrative because it's such an accessible way to get into it. And then maybe poetry. And then save like prophecy for having like that's where I would really want to read with someone who's a little bit more trained so that you can have some discussions about that.
Yeah, well, and if you've read the narrative and kind of went a little deeper on that, you've done the same thing with poetry. Once you get to the prophetic literature, especially the apocryphal literature, not apocryphal,
apocalyptic.
Yeah, apocalyptic. Thank you. The apocalyptic literature, you kind of have more of a foundation to even know what questions to ask, to even know an example is Isaiah, right? Isaiah kind of mixes a bunch of different things. And so sometimes it's talking about Jesus and sometimes it's not. And it's like, and it's easy to, if you're just kind of strip mining the text for what you want to hear, to go, oh, this is definitely a promise for me. When it's like, well, he was actually talking about Israel, right?
Right.
And
yes.
And so you have to get that whole deal. So I think that's an amazing idea for folks. And the part of what, the theme of a lot of what you're talking about is going deeper. And there is, when you go deeper in scripture versus let's get quality versus quantity. When you dip into it qualitatively, you can feed your soul in a different way. It's more of a depth than like a daily inspiration. And there's nothing wrong with daily inspiration. Right. Like daily inspiration, we need it. We all need it. But you're talking about like what feeds your soul and understanding of going, well, now I see in this psalm, I see that these are the repetition, right? And so we said the same thing and we said it again. And in English, like, if you're at a, you might read and go, well, why did they say the same thing twice? But then you dip it into it and you go, oh, that's so cool, right? They're getting the point home. So I love that idea.
Right.
That idea of thinking, going deeper, but picking a genre and starting with narrative. Because narrative, we're all wired for story. And so story is something that we can pick up and connect with, and there are characters that we love, and there's drama, and there's all sorts of things.
Yeah, and on the narrative front, real quick note is that we are so comfortable because most of us probably grew up in a church that functionally preached and taught from the New Testament. So what I mean by that is I'll ask students at the beginning of every semester, growing up in your church, how many sermons a year do you think you would hear on the Old Testament? And then I would hear anything from, 20% to maybe even 50%, which always surprised me a little bit. Yeah. Then I would say, okay, now take Psalms out and take Genesis and Exodus out, and how many sermons a year would you hear? And then they would definitely drop down to, well, now it's like 10%. Yeah. And I'm saying, how many of you guys ever heard a really well thought out or in-depth sermon series on Joel? And maybe one hand if I'm lucky. How many of you guys ever heard a good sermon series or even a single sermon from Haggai or Habakkuk? And it's like maybe one or two hands. So what I'm finding is most of us were kind of raised up to just think that the New Testament rendered the Old Testament sort of optional. And here's where that comes from, I think, in my opinion. I think it's this view that the New Testament replaces the Old Testament. And so what it is if you know the New Testament, all the stuff in the Old Testament really is kind of optional for you, because we just think of it as prelude or maybe just kind of intro or context. And I think that's where we just do a disservice to it. And so here's where I'm getting to. Sorry, it was roundabout.
Oh, it's so good.
In the New Testament, the epistolary literature is generally didactic. I'm sorry to use all these terms, but didactic means it is written for direct teaching and application, meaning you don't have to take sections of Ephesians and really do a lot of interpretational gymnastics to make it relevant, because Paul does all that for you. Right. Reading Paul is almost like eating Gerbers. It's like already processed. Yeah. And so you take a bite and it's like it just goes right into your body. You don't have to cook it. You don't have to chew it. And because it's the genre, it is teaching literature. So it preaches really easy. That's why pastors love the New Testament. Yeah. I can just take a section out of Colossians if I can just follow Paul's outline, and it becomes my sermon outline.
Right, and that's how we can do series through the New Testament, because
that's right.
It's basically laid out for you.
So here's what's hard about the Old Testament. There is no didactic writing, not at least in the way we're used to it in the New. There are no epistles of Moses. There are no epistles of, Isaiah. They are writing and speaking and conveying their revelation in very indirect ways, so to speak. Meaning, God's telling stories to us in the Old Testament. And it's up to us to chew on those stories and then glean our biblical theology first, and then our systematic theology from that. And that takes some gymnastics. It takes a little bit more skill. And so that's why I think sometimes reading the Old Testament gets flattened into just telling VBS stories. And that's where we do an injustice. So when I teach Ruth, I ask students, how many of you guys heard that this is a love story and it's about finding your Boaz? And I am always saddened to see how many hands go up. And I go, how many of you guys have ever heard a good series or did a Bible study on Ruth where you discussed questions about the treatment of the vulnerable and marginalized? maybe one hand or so, but very few. How many of you guys ever heard this as a discussion about the protection of widows and foreigners? Not many. How many of you guys ever looked at this as a discussion about gender roles? And again, so there's so much going on there that we just kind of turn into, oh no, this is a beautiful story about Ruth finding Boaz, and they're both beautiful, righteous people. So we're just so happy that they find each other. And I'm like, that's all there. I'm not disputing that, but you're missing so much if that's all you're seeing there. And so I think the thing that's hard for most people is is taking what is narrative or poetry or prophetic oracle and then doing theology from that. It's just harder. The epistles make it so much easier because it's almost like Paul, Peter, John, James, they're kind of telling you the bottom line. Yeah. They're even giving you application in a lot of cases. But it takes more work to read a story from 2,000-3,000 years ago and then say, well, how is this relevant to us today? Yeah. And then what am I going to take away from this? So it takes more work, and I think sometimes that's daunting for folks.
Yeah, man, right? Because we turned Ruth into The Bachelor, right? It's like, it's a love story that's like, oh, it's Downton Abbey with the kinsman redeemer that comes in and does all that, right? I remember that term. Thank you, Dr. O,
yes,
for teaching me that one. Sorry, Dr. O was my professor for, and he was awesome. Anyway, but we simplify these stories, and we're pulling this theme that can be easily understood out of it because we're so used to pre-processed food. And as pastors, it is great to pick up Paul because Paul's done all the work. There's not a lot you need to add. You need to, you can contextualize it of, this is what it meant for the people at the time. This is what it means for all time. This is what it means for you. Sure. You can do that. But with what you're talking about with some of these stories from the Old Testament, it's like getting wood from Home Depot versus a prefab shed. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's a great way to put it.
And so you get this thing like, okay, I got to build this wall. I got to build that wall. When you can do it, it's fantastic. And it's like, I made this shed. But when you don't have those tools to do that, it just looks very daunting.
Yep. Yeah. Oh. And I get into this with my students. I tell them I'm not naive. I know that many of you will finish your fourth semester of Hebrew, and then you are going to be tempted to never open your BHS again. And I tell them, please don't fall into that. Even if it's hard, read in your Hebrew Bible, because there is so much gain that will outweigh the cost. There is a cost. It's much harder, but you will benefit. So, that's a great way to put it. Sometimes we just are a little bit, we don't want to always get the parts and cook from scratch. We really do like it when we can pull up to the drive-thru and someone just kind of hands us the meal that's already wonderfully made. But that's what makes OT hard for folks.
Yeah, I was going to say that Paul's food was In-N-Out, but I know that you might not be an In-N-Out guy. So maybe it's Whataburger.
I have learned my lesson, John. I am going to stay out of those burgers. So quick thought. What I've learned from Twitter and other social media is this. What people think are arguments, and very heartfelt, passionate arguments about what is better tasting or what is better cuisine, I think it's really a proxy for our pride of place. And that it really has more to do with where you grew up and with whom you grew up than anything to do with actual objective flavor or cuisine.
Absolutely. Quality. It's nostalgia.
Yep.
Because
that's exactly what
and so I'm a California boy, right? I got my Clippers sweatshirt on.
Yep.
SoCal. In-N-Out was the place that we went after.
That's right.
Hey, you go after graduation, you go after prom, you go. So when we eat In-N-Out, we're not just tasting the burger, or people criticize the fries all the time, right? We're not tasting these terrible fries. We're tasting being 15 and being out at 1 a.m. On toilet papering houses, right? We're thinking after our game when we were 9 and we hit a home run and we ate there. And the same thing with Whataburger folks of like,
exactly.
They're not thinking, they're thinking the part after the party at the Moon Tower, to borrow a Dazed and Confused reference.
Sure. That's exactly what it is. It's, I grew up a big part of my life in Texas, so I'm just used to a burger being prepared a certain way. And with Whataburger, that meant the onions were going to be fresh, not grilled, and that the main condiment was going to be mustard, not ketchup or mayo, and that these were going to be big old fat meat patties with cheese. And so I came to appreciate that as a burger. And that's where my nostalgia is. You're exactly right. I agree. And so I think what happens with a lot of these discussions is we're arguing about like which burger is better or which pizza is better. You see that one a lot. But really what we're doing is we're defending our pride of place. Wow. We grew up in a certain place, whether it's in New York or Chicago or down south, and we just have so much nostalgic pride for the chicken that we grew up eating. And so then it's our nature to say, well, that means your chicken can't possibly be any good. Right. Or your burger can't possibly be any good. Or your pizza can't be. So I will stay out of those now because I've learned my lesson. I'm never going to convince a Californian that Whataburger's good, and they're not really going to ever convince me that In-N-Out's better than Whataburger. It's just the way we grew up, and I'm okay with that. We're like
wired. It's so funny on a globalized platform. This is like a very tribal kind of thing. Of just like it's provincial. Of like, I like Whataburger. Let me just say it since I'm in Texas. Okay, I like Whataburger. Okay. My thing is, why can't we have two nice things? Let's have Whataburger. It's great. Sometimes you're in the mood for one or the other.
Sure.
But you would never, ever convince me that Whataburger is better than In-N-Out.
It's just, sure. And I'm not going to try.
Yeah.
Yep. And I don't really see a need to do that because I know why you love In-N-Out. And so, hey, you have that. I have my childhood and let's just, move on.
I love it.
I kind of laugh now because there was a time I think where I kind of got into those, and there are certain people on Twitter who are always trying to poke that with a stick, but I'm now to the point where I've kind of grown and I'm like, hey, if you want a dog Whataburger, I'm not even going to respond because, hey, that's your thing, man. You probably just grew up somewhere and that's just not how you like burgers. So.
It's fantastic. I love the way you talked about it at the pride of place. Hey, before you go, I do want to talk to you a little bit. This was not planned, but we talked about it before we started recording.
Sure.
And it connects to some of the Twitter sphere of the hot take culture and pop culture and all of those kinds of things. You were talking a little bit about like what some circles of evangelical Christianity have kind of done to art, right? And what that can, and this was a very artistic discussion. You're such a philosophical, creative guy. I love it. But you were talking about that. Can you just spend a moment just talking about what you were talking to me about with art and all of that?
Yeah. So, man, I love this topic, and this could easily be an entire conversation on its own. But one of the things that I have really come to appreciate is that I grew up in a Korean church. And so we were kind of separate. We were very conservative theologically, but we were not really part of the inner circle of white evangelical culture. So what I mean by that is it's not a disparaging comment about Christianity. It's about culture. And one of the blind spots that really frustrates me is that so many white evangelicals do not realize that they swim in water too. And so it's that old David Bentley Hart kind of like illustration about the old fish comes across these two young fish. And he just says, hey, how's the water? And then they look at each other and they're like, what's water? And so I think what I say that to set this up. I think that we had our own issues. Please don't think of this as some sort of saying that, Korean Christianity is flawless. It's not. We have our own issues, and we definitely need to address those. But one of the things I appreciated growing up was I never got the full dose of all the white evangelical, gatekeeping when it came to purity culture, when it came to the way, like we never had to burn any albums or CDs or tapes, and I hear horror stories about people who had to do that. And so I remember having arguments here and there with my parents about like they weren't too happy with some of the early hip hop stuff I was bringing into the house. And fair enough. There was probably some stuff that it may not have been like the most edifying. But what I am so thankful for is that I was pretty much given some space when it came to reading books, watching movies, and listening to music. My parents were kind of like, they were like, and being immigrants is a factor here. My parents didn't have the pop culture awareness to always know what we were doing, me and my brother. And so I think that helped us get away with some stuff. One of my favorite stories is getting my mom to take us to go watch Aliens, the second movie. And we were at the time, I was 15, my brother was 12, so we weren't old enough, and it was rated R. So we told our mom, and I still feel so terrible to this day, that it was like Star Wars, and that would she take us to this movie because it was super popular. So she wasn't a fan, but she was just like, fine. So she takes us, we go to this theater, and I still remember like it was yesterday, the look on her face and the gasp and the shock when the alien comes bursting out of that one colonist's chest. And my mom is just she's a 4'9" Korean woman, and she's screaming like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. Like she's seeing the devil. Yeah. Like she's trying to do an exorcism right there in the theater, and she's slapping me because she's sitting next to me and she's hitting me, and it's like, what is this? What is this? And we're just like, oh, we didn't know, Mom. I'm so sorry. And so we but this was, sorry, I just had to share that story.
That's an incredible story. Don't ever apologize for sharing that story.
Yeah. So, but we were able to watch a lot of things on TV, and we were latchkey kids, but also it was part of where I grew up. I actually grew up in a predominantly Black neighborhood and community. And so I was just being exposed to a lot of things culturally that really were, in the end, I was so thankful for in retrospect, because it allowed me to appreciate art in different ways. And I think what we do in evangelical culture is we do a modern version of like legalism. So one of the ways in which legalism kind of embodied in first century Judaism was kind of creating these hedges. And so they would take the original content of the Torah, and they were so scared of violating Torah that what they would do is they would create secondary laws and rules. And so, for example, like the Sabbath, they would have these very intricate sets of regulations or kind of commentary on the Sabbath law, saying, okay, you're allowed to go this many steps, but if you go more than that, you are now in violation. You've done work. You can do this, but you can't do that, And it was an attempt to basically protect the sanctity of the Torah. So I think it was well-intentioned, but it misunderstood the heart of the Torah. And I think we do the same thing. I get it. We do not want our kids necessarily just consuming unchecked, like things that can be very damaging. So I think a fair set of boundaries is it age appropriate more than it is necessarily, like what is. And so I grew up with friends who were in white evangelical contexts who were like, oh, we can't see that movie. I go, why not? It's R. I go, yeah, but it's not that bad. And they go, no, but we have a rule. And so I think we do this. I think we create this legalism around art and pop culture. And it really, I think it's a shame, because I think my view of art and pop culture is that it's part of the revelation and the beauty of humanity as God intended. And so when I think of total depravity, I think my favorite expression in super simplistic terms is the image of God was not erased, but it was defaced. And so it's not that we're all the absolute worst people we could possibly be. It just means that every aspect of us in our humanity has been tainted by sin. Yeah. But that goes even for the redeemed, even for those who are believers. And so I just don't think it's healthy to create this artificial boundary of saying if it doesn't have Christian on the label, we should not even consume it. Yeah. And I just think about families that have those sort of gates and what their children or even they miss out on by not seeing what art could tell us about the world that God created. So I am a firm believer that art is a wonderful mirror and a lens, and that you don't have to be a Christian. Some people are just gifted with vision. And so those directors and writers and artists and musicians, even in their work, there is so much beauty and so much we could learn if we're just willing to thoughtfully engage. So that's kind of my 2 cents on where I think sometimes our legalism kind of hurts us.
Man, I love
in the end, it takes away our ability to engage with people around us. You know, I don't want to be that guy at the water cooler at work who's like, well, I didn't watch that, and everyone's talking about it. It's kind of helpful if I can at least say, yeah, that was really interesting. I didn't like it, but here's why. You know, but yeah, I feel like there's this kind of legalism that and you can get into. There's people out there who are much more informed on tracing Puritan culture in that, Victorianism, things like that. But I'm just saying, as a casual observer, I'm like you. I love what we see out there and being able to consume it and wrestle with it and engage it.
Yeah.
And be critical at times. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for me, one, like pop culture was my first religion, right? Before I started going to church, it was the thing that I immersed myself in, and it said something about the world. Like, 9-year-old me wouldn't have known that, but I was reading TV Guide front to back because these stories, there was some kind of freedom in there. There's some kind of beauty. There was something that stirred something at a like primal level almost.
Yes.
And so I've come now as somebody who's believed in Jesus, like I see the breadcrumbs that lead back to him. Like all creativity feels like there's like a set of breadcrumbs that if you really follow the trail, you get back to the creator.
Yep.
And so I love your take on it and the beauty that we miss with art. And because it's not branded Christian. And there's common sense stuff you talk about. You don't want your 5-year-old to go to aliens, right?
Yeah.
And you probably don't want to take your Korean mom to aliens without her knowing what it is. That's an amazing story. I love the story so much. At some point, you got to be like, Mom, we got to talk about that. That incredible, but it's common sense of going. The rating is something to help you understand who this is appropriate for and what they can gain from it. And I think depriving, especially our kids, because I was also a resident advisor when I went to college. I didn't go to a Christian college. Okay. And so those kids go out into the world and a lot of times then they consume to a degree that's so unhealthy. And it's the same thing with purity culture, right? Of like this gatekeeping legalism where you draw a line so far away from what it's trying to protect you from that you just forget about it and go all the way over the line and back and across and forth again because it's forbidden and you want to access it. And so being smart about it.
I grew up in public schools and I went to public universities, every level up to seminary. So I'm with you. I think there's a danger in kind of sheltering our kids and then turning them loose that it doesn't prepare them well. Yeah. Let me give you one quick thing, John. Yes. I totally forgot to mention it in the OT part, but this will tie into the pop culture thing. So one of my favorite recent ways to kind of draw people into interest in the OT has been, and I love this one, if you are a fan of Marvel and what Marvel's doing in the MCU as well as in the Netflix sphere and some of the other Disney Plus type of spheres, which so many people are these days. Here's what I'm going to tell you. The OT is being the original OG comic book nerd. And so that is what you're missing as an MCU viewer or fan who never read any of the source material. So here's how I'm going to break it down. The NT is the MCU. We're getting kind of the high definition, live in color stuff that the OT was laying out for all these years. So I can go to an MCU movie, and this is my wife. So my wife was not a nerd growing up like I was. So she never read X-Men. She didn't, she doesn't have 5 copies of, Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man #1 sitting in a box. But I was that guy. So I'm coming into, and so we're both watching the same movie. But there are all these moments. So she's gonna, at the end of Avengers, the first one, she had a great time. She loved Iron Man. So she loves these movies. Yeah. In fact, she's a big fan of them now. But there were moments in every single movie where I am just going, whoa, did you see that? And here's why. It's because I recognize the names and the Easter eggs and the references, and I understood the context. And I would nudge her. I go, do you realize what's coming because of what they just showed on the screen there? And she's like, no, I have no idea. And I'm like, oh my goodness, they're setting up. And then I would explain, and she'd just be like, wow, I had no idea. This is what reading the New Testament is like when you don't read the Old Testament and appreciate it. The Old Testament is the source material. It's the scriptures that Jesus read. It's the scriptures that he preached. And I recently tweeted something about that. It seemed to kind of like strike a chord. I said, Jesus preached a lot of sermons. And do you know what his text was? It was the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And so you can still read the New Testament without any knowledge of the Old, and there's still so much there. You can understand what it means to believe towards salvation. You can know a lot about God, and there's a lot that's fleshed out in the NT that it's not fleshed out in the OT. So that's all true. But if you are that person who sat in these Marvel movies knowing the comic books, it's a whole different experience of appreciating these. And you are getting those nods and winks, but it's not just Easter eggs. It's more than that. Yeah. It's the ability to put what's going on in Iron Man 2 in larger context and go, oh man, I kind of want to know how they're going to take this, because I know from the comic books that I'm anticipating Tony Stark and the Demon in the Bottle storyline, and they never went there, which is okay. But it creates for me as a fan kind of like these expectations and the ability to kind of interact with these movies in ways that the non-comic book fan really couldn't. Yeah. And so I'm saying, as a student of Scripture, if you want to take your understanding of the New Testament to the next level, read the Old Testament and appreciate it, because that is what will take your understanding of the New Testament to the next level. So I thought you might like that one, since we're both kind of pop culture nerds.
Might like it. I love it. That's wonderful, because it's like, I think I'm going the opposite way. I didn't grow up reading much of the comics, but, Winter Soldier, right? The Winter Soldier, probably my favorite Marvel movie, right? Mm-hmm. And then I'm like, you know what? Let me read the Winter Soldier arc, right? And so you check it out from the library and you go, oh.
Or Civil War.
Yeah, Civil War. Right now we're watching the Book of Boba Fett. Are you watching right now?
Yeah.
Okay,
yep.
So the moment
we're in.
We all of a sudden we're like, there's a black Wookiee, and we're just like, that looks really mean. That guy looks awesome. And so me and my kids, I have a 10-year-old and a 6-year-old, we're both like, we got to find out everything we can about this guy. Mm-hmm. And it leads us to the Star Wars comics, right? Where there's this whole Legends canon. Star Wars is a little different than Marvel. But the point is, you're reading up and it seems cooler because you're going, oh, okay, they have a history. Oh, this is what the storyline could set up, and who could be coming into the story next. So study the Old Testament, be a Marvel Comics, be the Marvel Comics deep dive into the New Testament. Dr. Sam 1, that was awesome. Thank you so much for joining me today. I had a blast. We might need to have a whole other podcast just talking about pop culture.
Hey, well, you know where I am. You can always find me on the timeline. So, man, let's do it again if you want to. I'm always game.
Yeah, love it, man. Thank you so much for joining us.
I enjoyed it. Thanks, John. Thanks for the invite and the great conversation. And thanks also. I really do appreciate just being mutuals on Twitter, just being able to interact. And so, yeah, this has been fun.
My man. I had such a good time talking to Dr. Sam One. What an amazing dude. So much good pop culture knowledge, but probably more importantly, amazing Old Testament knowledge. I love the analogy he made to Marvel and the MCU. I also love the alien story. Golly, that's such a good story. It's worth it just to listen to that story. Hey, if you want to know more about Sam and check him out, you can take his class at Dallas Theological Seminary. He might teach more than one. Or you can catch him on Twitter. That's probably a little easier for everybody at SamObi1. That's Sam, SAMOBOBI 1, WON. Hey, thank you guys for being a part of all this. Click the subscribe button wherever you're watching or listening to this. And if you have questions, you can leave a comment or you can leave a voice memo on Anchor or Spotify, or you can email me at john@betterontheinside.com. This podcast is a City Church production in collaboration, conjunction, and part of the Church Digital Network. Some amazing folks doing amazing stuff over there. Love y'all, and I'll see y'all again soon.